I'm Brian Stewart. It's very nice to see so many of you come out, such a full and lively crowd. It's a great pleasure. Thanks for coming. It's a very serious subject. I think most of you know quite a bit about it yourself and realize how concerned people are about the future of aid in Canada. Samantha Nutt, Dr. Samantha Nutt, will be out shortly to outline the panel discussion we're going to have in the conference. So I just want to take care of a few housekeeping duties first. Above all, not above all, but starting out, I want to thank those who have helped put on this presentation. And I really like to emphasize, let's focus on thanking the people because they're very valuable. The Canadian International Council, the Trudeau Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, University of Toronto, and the Mosaic Institute. I do also want to bring attention to the sponsors, tremendously valuable putting on something like this. This Aeroplan, Beyond Miles, the Center for United States Studies at the University of Toronto, and the Printing House. I'd also like to bring attention, by the way, to Mr. Eric Hoskins, who is Minister for Child and Youth Services for the Government of Ontario, and somebody who knows the world we're going to be talking about tonight profoundly well and has seen some of the worst and most dangerous parts of it. Mr. Minister, thank you very much for coming. And he is, of course, the husband of Dr. Samantha Nutt. This makes it all better. Outline that, we're going to have a panel here, which will run on for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes. But we want to take a question and answer. So through the evening, if you have questions, please write them down. There'll be cue cards going throughout. Pass them to the aisle, and they will be passed on up to the stage. We do want to get your questions. At the end of the event, and this is very important, there's going to be a book signing out in the lobby. Dr. Samantha Nutt is going to be signing her book, Damn Nations, Greed, Guns, Armies, and Aid. A profoundly important book. I'm going to buy a few more to send to friends because I think an awful lot of people really have to read this book. Now, by way of introducing our opening speaker, Dr. Samantha Nutt, I want to mention that I began my own book review of her book when it came out on cbc.ca. When Damn Nations came out, I said it was one of those rare books that sometimes come along to whack you over the side of the head with a burst of reality about the world and what we should know about it. Well, Samantha Nutt's whole career has been a kind of needed reality check about our need to not only do the right thing, but to know and to study what the right approach is, to get the question of how to help correct. She's one of the most internationally respected humanitarian voices, a leading authority on the impact of war on civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, women and children. She's a medical doctor and a founder of War Child, and has worked out there in some of the world's most dangerous places, from Iraq to Somalia to Afghanistan, Darfur, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I was a foreign correspondent. There are many places that Samantha Nutt works in I would not have dared to go to. I just state that. She's always building new routes to advance human rights and social justice. The Globe and Mail called her one of Canada's 25 transformational Canadians. Time magazine calls her one of Canada's 5 leading activists. Incredibly, with all this going on in her life, she's also a staff physician at the Women's College Hospital and an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. And of course, all the time, there's War Child Canada. It is an extraordinary life, lived in a very large part of it for the benefit and the safety of others. It's a great honor for me to introduce you to Dr. Samantha Nutt.
My goodness, thank you very much, everyone. Good evening. I understand that people are being turned away at the door, so because we are officially sold out, which is something that's quite extraordinary for an evening to discuss aid and the future of aid. So I want to thank all of you here for coming, for supporting War Child, for engaging in what I think will be a very important and timely discussion. And I also want to just say a word of thanks to Brian Stewart, whose career has been absolutely remarkable, and his contribution to the discussion around international development assistance has been so significant in this country and even beyond. And also Alison Rowe from War Child. Some of you may know her. She is a phenomenal force of nature, and she put this evening together, and it was a tremendous amount of work. And I just want to say, Ali, wherever you are, I think you're probably on a headset somewhere, but you rock, sister, and thank you very, very much. Now, tonight we reflect on the future of aid, which I suppose must be prefaced by the question of where aid is today and whether it should be allowed to exist, and if so, in what form in the future. And in essence, this is a tautological argument because aid exists not to exist, or at least this, in fact, should hold true. So any talk about the future of aid, it presumes that the current approach will neither be sufficient nor successful in achieving this goal. Or I guess to put it more simply, though I fear I may in fact be too late, if we maintain that aid has a future, we have to accept that aid is not, in and of itself, a solution to war or to poverty or to human misery. So what are the limitations of aid in its present form? And what might we do differently moving forward? Well, to begin with, and this is something that I do address in some detail in my book, Damned Nations, and that is my only shameless book plug of the evening. But we aren't, frankly, spending enough money on aid. And when we do spend money, we spend it on the wrong things. We don't spend enough money specifically to support the kind of consistent long-term investments that are needed to address the underlying structural deficits, particularly when it comes to education and to income, that plague those at the bottom of the Human Development Index. And this may seem axiomatic, but for aid to work, we cannot continue to shortchange it. And so consider this. We know that increased education levels, especially among girls, that these decrease infant, maternal, and child mortality. And we know that increased education levels reduce fertility rates and improve quality of life indicators, including household income. And we know that increased education levels also reduce the likelihood of violence and armed conflict around the world. But raising education levels through consistent development programming, the kind of development programming which would ultimately reduce the need for aid over the long term, well, this kind of thing, it takes time. It takes a lot of time, actually. It takes at least a generation, if not two, to be precise. And such programs must be widely available and accessible, which is expensive, in the order of billions of dollars, which when we consider the cost of our ongoing militarization each year, which globally is in the order of trillions of dollars, suddenly that aim seems to be much more affordable. And yet in the wake of the current economic recession, in fact, even before the current economic recession, and with the exception of the Scandinavian countries, most Western nations maintained low aid commitments relative to their national wealth. For its part, for example, Canada has been among the most moribund countries when it comes to aid spending. In fact, we have yet to recover from the cutbacks to our foreign aid that took place during the dot-com implosion of the 1990s, with our annual contributions hovering at about 0.3% of our national wealth, even though the United Nations target of 0.7% was set by who? Lester B. Pearson, in the year that I was born. Now, this is scary for two reasons. One, it shows that I'm getting old. And two, more than 40 years later, we as Canadians cannot even stand by the very principles that we laid out. And I have no choice, no doubt, actually, that Mr. Pearson, had he been given the choice, would have passed on the airport and opted for a more robust Canadian aid policy. The current economic recession has only served to lower the amount of aid funding available worldwide, raising doubts about its future efficacy and doubts about the likelihood of sustaining any gains that have been realized in recent years. And so, in addition to consistently missing our own aid targets, and unabashedly so, Canada has also maintained a vision for foreign aid that swings unapologetically between what and hey, let's try this. Now, some will blame successive minority governments for this, but I think that that's misguided. Because to be honest, CETA didn't know what it wanted to be long before it became an afterthought. Now is the precise moment when people who work with me start finding ways to lose their business cards. But don't worry, they know I'm like this. They just usually hope I won't be like this in public. But in part, we can blame the politics of aid for this lack of consistency and rigor. The only time aid seems to capture our collective imaginations is when there is a scandal or a high-profile disaster. And this isn't me just being cynical, and I prefer the word pragmatic anyway, although I suppose I am being a little bit cynical. But we expect a great deal from aid. We expect it to save lives. We expect it to be simple. We expect it to be a quick fix. And we are bored by aid when these tropes forsake us. But aid is none of these things, and we must begin to accept this, because in the most basic sense, aid is only one thing. And here I'm going to use a word that has become so overwrought that it verges on the cliche, but it nevertheless applies. Aid is hope. It is the opportunity through collective action to mold prosperity from the ashes of ruin. It is the child achieving a future that once could never have been imagined. It is the optimism of a mother striving to see a better day. Aid is not perfect, but then hope is not perfect either. Hope can leave us feeling embittered and disillusioned, skeptical and frustrated, exhausted and mistrustful. And every time we degrade aid, every time we promise and then don't deliver, as in Haiti, where more than 2 years after the earthquake, about 50% of the total financial contributions that were made have actually been dispersed. And every time we, as NGOs, as non-governmental organizations, every time we set up, build up, hand out, dictate, and then scale down, as we have in Darfur and Afghanistan, as we did 20 years ago in Somalia and soon will again, as we have in the Democratic Republic of Congo over and over and over. Every time we do these things, we compound aid's inefficiencies by exhausting hope. And what remains in the aftermath of such failed promises is a sense of betrayal at the local level, diminished community resiliency and autonomy, unmanageable expectations, and aid dependency. And then we respond in turn, unfortunately, by cutting aid back, by changing our priorities. We yawn at certain countries and certain crises. We create new buzzwords like efficacy and transparency and matched funding. And then we return to making grand pronouncements and promises and start all over again, only to find ourselves standing still. So how do we break this cycle? How do we ensure that in the future, aid has no future? And so here we face competing visions. Some, like Dambisa Moyo and Jeffrey Sachs, they have argued that economic investment offers the only practical alternative to the problems of aid. And I don't disagree, but to a point. Economic self-reliance through income generation, especially small business development at the local level, is a laudable goal. But the scars of unfettered capitalism run deep across the African landscape in particular. from the pillaged mud basins of the Congo's mining areas to the scorched agro-villages of West Darfur, cleared of their indigenous populations, courtesy of China's foreign direct investment, FDI, as Dambisa calls it, that foreign direct investment in the preposterous government of Omar al-Bashir, who stands indicted for war crimes, to say nothing of recent developments in Nigeria. And as one final example on this, even entrepreneurialism has its limits. You know, poppy cultivation has been successful in creating income generation for poor Afghan farmers for decades, with considerable, however, criminal FDI. But who would maintain that therein lies the solution to Afghanistan's woes? And we can therefore draw only one conclusion when it comes to capital cure-alls for aid. If they work at all, they only work in countries that have already attained a certain level of prosperity and governance. Free market ideology is far less likely to benefit the poorest of the poor. After all, few people really believe in trickle-down theories of economics anymore, right? And for good reason. Or to fix countries embroiled in civil war. Indeed, the evidence suggests that this kind of free market ideology can actually make things worse. The future of aid, therefore, cannot be found in economic theory alone. And no, this does not make me a Marxist. Alternative proposals to make aid more useful and accountable include writing checks directly to national governments of developing countries. And this approach is now enshrined in the 2005 Paris Principles on Aid Effectiveness. Called bilateral aid, this reduces the ability of international aid organizations to set up parallel structures, as is our wont, and gives local government a stronger role in decision-making. But these aid solutions are limited by the same constraints as free market ones. The ideology collapses, or at least it ought to collapse, in the face of corrupt, oppressive governments who would more readily fill shipping containers with Kalashnikov rifles than with school books. And this was how and why NGOs emerged in the first place, when politics got in the way of responding to human suffering, and when governments were neither able nor willing to meet the basic human needs of their own populations. As an alternative, we could exclude those governments that are likely to misappropriate aid by pouring money into NGOs instead. But the list of governments excluded would be long, and we would quickly find ourselves back where we started, where the structural deficits remain, where the decision-making is largely driven by outsiders with vested interests, and where there is no cohesive strategy or coordination. And in this scenario, the future of aid looks a hell of a lot like the present. And perhaps this is aid's future, to keep doing what we're doing until we can do it no longer, which may in fact be soon, as aid organizations around the world wrestle with increasing insecurity and violence towards their staff and decreasing funding. But what if we go back to this notion of aid as hope? What if we reject the idea that the success of aid has anything to do with those of us living here at all, but can be found in the resilience and tenacity of those for whom aid is intended? What if we stopped understanding aid as something that we do for others, and instead recognize that it only works when it creates the space for others to do? To paraphrase, let's stop deluding ourselves that aid is actually about us, about the schools we built, about the volunteer trips we took, about our trade and economic interests, or about the lives we saved. If this is aid's future, and I believe, in fact, it must be, then we must commit to different principles. We must commit to a consistent aid policy that emphasizes long-term development rather than short-term relief. And this doesn't mean that we completely abandon emergency relief, but it means that we go in search of greater balance in our aid policy. And all of us as individual donors, we must follow suit. Granting cycles ought to be for 10-year terms, with the flexibility to reform, revise, and adapt programs through an iterative process that is driven by local communities and not by bureaucratic convenience or by shifting ministerial agendas. And where we fall down as international aid organizations most commonly is in the area of genuine mentorship and partnership at the local level. We need to build and fund programs that invest in and prepare national staff and local civil society groups, and that value these achievements as much as the number of bags of grain distributed, shelters erected, and patients treated. 2- and 3-year grant terms with an emphasis on high visibility activities and easily quantifiable effectiveness indicators. Those kinds of things work against such outcomes. We must also abandon our belief that isolated investments, individual acts of generosity in the form of a single well or a goat or a handout, a one-time handout, that these will be anything more than transient. And to do that, we must raise our level of development literacy in the media, in our schools and universities, and among our elected officials. We must remove trade barriers and subsidies that allow so that developing markets are allowed to compete. And we must reignite foreign diplomacy and multilateralism. We must also, and this will be controversial, I'm on a roll after my op-ed yesterday. My goodness, I managed to step on it. People expect nothing less from me, I guess. But here we go. We must also challenge those organizations willing to pander to ignorance and to act as subcontractors of political and corporate interests, especially when these interests have the potential to harm local communities. Thank you, War Child people. Is all aid by its very nature a form of soft imperialism? No. It depends on how it's done. Is all government funding compromised? No. It depends on what is being asked for in exchange. Is all corporate funding suspect? Absolutely not. But some of it is, and we ought to know the difference. And so let me conclude by saying that tonight, as we discuss the future of aid, there will be some who believe that any effort to address the underlying global inequalities and social justice challenges that we face, that this is naive and idealistic and simplistic and childish. I'm called a few of those things. There is a prevailing assumption, and this is one that I regularly confront. I suppose it's because my last name is Nutt. But one of the prevailing assumptions is that those of us who struggle to articulate and invest in solutions, that we are somehow less intellectually astute than those who are mired in cynicism. Let me tell you that these are vacuous criticisms leveled by those who lack the creative and intellectual fortitude to propose and debate alternatives. Tonight, in this sold-out audience, we defy them. Aid is imperfect, but that does not mean it is without potential. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samantha. I should mention that all proceeds from tonight and the sale of the book will be going to War Child Canada.